The smoke was still rising from the charred remains of what had once been a homestead, when 26-year-old Catherine Walsh stumbled upon a sight that would haunt her dreams and change her destiny forever. 8 pairs of hollow eyes stared back at her from the shadows of a partially collapsed root cellar. Children ranging in age from 3 to 14, their clothes torn and filthy, their faces gaunt with hunger and despair. The youngest, a little girl with matted blonde hair, clutched a corn husk, doll that had seen better days. The oldest, a boy with premature lines etched around his eyes, stood protectively in front of the others, a rusted knife trembling in his small hands. "Please don't hurt us," he whispered, his voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. Catherine's heart shattered in that moment. She had traveled 1,200 miles from Pennsylvania to marry a rancher named Samuel Morrison in the Nebraska Territory, only to find his homestead burned to ash and her intended husband nowhere to be found. Now she faced 8 orphaned souls who would die without her help, and she had barely enough supplies to keep herself alive through the approaching winter. But this moment of discovery was still 3 days in Catherine's future. 3 days earlier, she'd been filled with hope and nervous excitement, believing she was traveling toward a secure future with a kind man who had promised her a home, a family, and a chance at happiness she had never known. Before we jump back, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days earlier, Catherine Walsh had pressed her face against the grimy window of the Union Pacific Railroad car, watching the endless Nebraska prairie roll past in waves of golden grass that seemed to stretch to the very edge of the earth. The September sun beat down mercilessly on the train, turning the passenger car into a sweltering oven that made her heavy traveling dress cling uncomfortably to her skin. She clutched Samuel Morrison's most recent letter in her sweating palm, though she had memorized every word during the long journey from Philadelphia. His handwriting was careful and deliberate, speaking of a man who took his time with important matters. "My dear Catherine," it began, "I count the days until September 18th when you will arrive at the Kearney station. I have spent these months preparing our home for your arrival, expanding the cabin to include a proper bedroom and adding a kitchen garden where you can grow herbs and vegetables. The prairie can be harsh, but it rewards those who work hard and treat it with respect." Catherine had read those words hundreds of times during her journey west, finding comfort in Samuel's obvious sincerity and practical approach to their upcoming marriage. Unlike many of the crude advertisements she had seen in the Philadelphia newspapers, Samuel's notice had been thoughtful and respectful. "Established homesteader in Nebraska Territory seeks intelligent woman of good character for marriage. Must be willing to embrace frontier life and share in building something lasting. No drinkers, gamblers, or those seeking easy fortune. Serious inquiries only." The correspondence that followed had revealed a man of 34 who had spent 6 years carving a life out of the Nebraska wilderness. Samuel wrote about his small herd of cattle, his hopes for expanding into wheat farming, and his deep loneliness in a land where the nearest neighbor was 8 miles away. He was honest about the hardships, the brutal winters, the constant wind, the isolation that could drive people to madness. But he also wrote with genuine love for the wide open spaces and the satisfaction of building something permanent in a country that was still finding its shape. Catherine had answered his advertisement out of desperation rather than romance. At 26, she was considered a spinster by Philadelphia society, too old and too poor to attract a husband among the city's established families. Her parents had died in a tenement fire 2 years earlier, leaving her with nothing but debts and the skills she had learned working in a textile mill. The boarding house where she lived was expensive and dangerous, filled with men who looked at unprotected women with predatory eyes. Samuel Morrison represented safety, respectability, and the chance to build a real home instead of merely surviving. From week to week, their letters had grown warmer over the months, and Catherine had begun to hope that their arrangement might develop into genuine affection, perhaps even love. Samuel wrote about wanting a true partner, not just a housekeeper or ornament, but a woman who could share the work and the dreams of frontier life. Most importantly, Samuel had sent money for her journey without her asking, along with detailed instructions for reaching his homestead and promises that if she found him unsuitable, he would ensure her safe return to Philadelphia. This gesture of trust and consideration had convinced Catherine that Samuel Morrison was indeed an honorable man worth the enormous risk she was taking. Now, as the train approached Kearney, Catherine tried to calm her nerves by reviewing the practical preparations she had made. She had sold everything of value except her mother's pearl brooch and her father's watch, using the money to purchase supplies Samuel had suggested. Yards of sturdy fabric, needles and thread, basic medicines, and a small collection of seeds. For the kitchen garden he had mentioned, her single trunk contained everything she owned: 3 dresses, undergarments, a warm cloak, the supplies, and a few treasured books that had belonged to her mother. Catherine had also spent her final weeks in Philadelphia learning what she could about frontier life. Mrs. O'Brien, the Irish cook at her boarding house, had taught her to preserve meat without ice and make bread rise in cold weather. Mr. Jameson, at the general store, had explained the basics of managing supplies when stores were far apart. And even Dr. Kellerman had given her a small bottle of laudanum and basic medical supplies, warning her that doctors were scarce in farming country. But all the preparation in the world couldn't quiet the fundamental questions that haunted Catherine, as mile after mile of strange country rolled past her window. What if Samuel Morrison was not the kind man his letters suggested? What if the prairie was harsher than she could endure? What if she had made a terrible mistake in leaving everything familiar for a life with a man she had never met? Catherine had seen other women make desperate choices in Philadelphia. Mary Kowalski had married a widower with 7 children who treated her like an unpaid servant. Sarah Murphy had accepted work in a factory where dangerous conditions killed or maimed workers regularly. Catherine herself had faced the prospect of eventual destitution as her looks faded and her opportunities dwindled in a city that offered few chances for women without family or fortune. Marriage to Samuel Morrison represented her one real opportunity for a different life, but it required betting everything on a man she knew only through words on paper. He could be cruel, dishonest, or simply incompatible with her temperament. The Nebraska territory could be more brutal than she imagined, the isolation more crushing than liberating. She might find herself trapped in a life worse than the one she was leaving, with no resources to escape and no way home. Yet, as the train crossed into Nebraska and the landscape began to open up in ways Catherine had never experienced, she felt a surprising sense of liberation. For the first time in her adult life, she was making an active choice about her future, instead of simply accepting whatever circumstances presented themselves. She was not merely surviving from week to week, but actively pursuing a vision of the life she wanted to live. Samuel's letters had revealed a man who read books, who thought deeply about the land and his place in it, who wanted a wife he could, and talked to about more than household duties. He wrote about the beauty of sunrise over the prairie, about the satisfaction of watching his cattle thrive on the rich grass, about his dreams of building a prosperous farm that could support a large family. These were not the words of a man who would mistreat a woman or view her as property. The journey from Philadelphia to Kearney took 4 days, with changes in Chicago and Omaha. At each stop, Catherine observed how the crowds grew rougher and more diverse as they moved away from the civilized East. Farmers returning from selling crops, ranchers heading to new territories, immigrants seeking farmland. women traveling to join husbands or brothers already established in the West. The conversations she overheard spoke of opportunities and dangers unknown in Philadelphia, of prairie fires that could destroy everything in their path, of Indian raids, of blizzards that lasted for weeks, of fortunes made and lost with a single season's harvest. In Omaha, Catherine shared a meal with Mrs. Dorothy Henderson, a widow traveling to join her son's family in Colorado. Mrs. Henderson had made a similar journey 15 years earlier as a young bride and offered practical advice about frontier life. "The first thing you must understand," Mrs. Henderson said over coffee in the station restaurant, "is that the frontier judges women by different standards than city society does. Out there, nobody cares if you can play piano or speak French. What matters is whether you can work from sunrise to sunset without complaining, whether you can make do with less, and whether you have the backbone to endure hardship without breaking." She paused to study Catherine's face carefully. "You have an honest face and capable hands. That will serve you well. But the real test is whether you can adapt your thinking as quickly as your circumstances. The West changes people usually, for the better if they let it." Catherine absorbed this wisdom, noting how Mrs. Henderson carried herself with a quiet confidence that spoke of hard-won experience. This was what she wanted to become. Not merely a survivor, but a woman shaped by challenge into something stronger than she had been. As the train pulled into Kearney Station, Catherine's nervousness intensified. In less than an hour, she would meet the man who might become her husband, see the home that might become hers, and begin a life that would either fulfill her dreams or destroy them. She had no way of knowing which outcome awaited her, but she faced that uncertainty with growing determination. Whatever Samuel Morrison proved to be, whatever challenges the Nebraska Territory presented, Catherine Walsh was ready to meet them on her own terms. She had left Philadelphia as a woman with few options. She would enter Kearney as a woman prepared to fight for her future. The train whistle announced their arrival as the frontier town came into view, a collection of wooden buildings scattered along the railroad tracks, surrounded by an ocean of grass that stretched to the horizon. Smoke rose from chimneys, and Catherine could see men working around livestock corrals and loading freight wagons. It looked crude and temporary compared to Philadelphia, but it also looked alive with possibility. As she gathered her belongings and prepared to step into her new life, Catherine thought of Samuel's promise in his letters that they would build something lasting together on the prairie. Whether that promise would be kept remained to be seen, but she was ready to find out. The conductor called Kearney, and Catherine Walsh stepped from the train into the dry Nebraska air, her future stretching ahead of her like the vast prairie sky. But the wooden platform of Kearney's railroad station was smaller and rougher than Catherine had expected. As she stepped down with her traveling bag, the endless wind that characterized the Nebraska prairie hit her immediately, tugging at her skirts and threatening to lift her carefully pinned hat from her head. She looked around the small crowd, gathered around the train, searching for Samuel Morrison's face among the weathered farmers and ranchers who had come to collect supplies and passengers. Samuel had described himself as tall, with brown hair and a beard, wearing a blue shirt and dark hat when he met her train. But as Catherine scanned the faces around her, no one stepped forward with the warm smile of recognition she had expected. No established homesteader approached to claim his mail-order bride. Catherine stood alone on the platform as the train prepared to continue its journey west, her confidence beginning to waver. She approached the station agent, a thin man with a grey mustache who was checking papers at a wooden desk. "Excuse me, sir. I'm looking for Samuel Morrison. He was supposed to meet the afternoon train." The agent looked up with sharp eyes that seemed to assess her instantly. "Sam Morrison. Haven't seen him today, miss. Though that could mean anything, Sam's place is a fair distance out of town, and sometimes farming doesn't follow train schedules. Catherine felt the first stirring of unease. Samuel's letter had been specific about meeting the September 18th train. How far is his homestead? Could something have delayed him? Oh, maybe 12, 15 miles northeast along Plum Creek. Could be any number of things kept him away. Sick livestock, equipment problems, early harvest work. Prairie farming doesn't stop for much of anything. The agent returned to his paperwork, dismissing her concerns with the casual indifference of someone who had seen many disappointed travelers. Catherine walked to the edge of the platform and looked out over the town and the vast grassland beyond. Kearney was larger than she had imagined from Samuel's descriptions, with perhaps 1,500 residents scattered along the main street. The town bustled with activity, freight wagons hauling supplies, riders coming and going, and the constant sound of construction that marked a growing community. But the settlement had a temporary, almost desperate quality that unsettled Catherine. Most buildings were simple wooden structures that looked like they could be abandoned at a moment's notice if circumstances changed. As the afternoon lengthened and Samuel failed to appear, Catherine's unease deepened into real worry. She had nowhere to go and limited funds for unexpected delays. Her travel money was carefully calculated to get her to Kearney with only a small reserve for emergencies. An extended stay in a hotel would quickly exhaust her resources. She approached a woman loading supplies into a wagon outside the general store. The woman was perhaps 35, dressed in practical calico and denim, with work-hardened hands and the direct manner of someone accustomed to frontier life. "Excuse me, ma'am. I'm Catherine Walsh, and I'm looking for Samuel Morrison. Do you know him?" The woman straightened and studied Catherine with curiosity. "Of course I know Sam. I'm Janet Parker. My husband Tom and I have the spread about 6 miles from Sam's place. You must be the bride he's been expecting." Relief flooded through Catherine. Finally, someone who knew Samuel and could help her understand the situation. "Yes, I am. He was supposed to meet my train, but he didn't show up. I'm beginning to worry something might be wrong." Janet's expression grew troubled. "That's not like Sam at all. He's reliable as clockwork, and he's been talking about your arrival for weeks. Been working on his cabin every spare minute, getting everything ready." She paused, clearly concerned. "Let me finish loading these supplies, and Tom and I will ride out to check on him. You can wait at the hotel." "How long would that take?" Catherine asked, though she was grateful for any help. "Hotel's decent enough. Mrs. Crawford runs it properly. As for checking on Sam, it's a hard ride there and back. Might not be back until tomorrow morning." Janet studied Catherine's anxious face. "Don't look so scared, honey. This is rough country. But Sam Morrison's a good man. If he's not here, there's a solid reason." The Kearney Hotel was a 2-story frame building that advertised clean rooms and good meals in peeling paint across its front. Mrs. Crawford, a stout woman with greying hair pulled back in a practical bun, welcomed Catherine warmly once she explained her situation. "Mr. Morrison, yes, he's mentioned you several times when he's been in town. Always asking about what supplies a lady might need. What would make his place more comfortable for a wife. Don't you worry, dear. Something's just held him up." The room Mrs. Crawford provided was small but clean, with a narrow bed, washstand, and single window overlooking the main street. Catherine unpacked her few belongings and tried to calm her growing anxiety by rereading Samuel's letters, looking for any clue about what might have gone wrong. His most recent letter, dated just 10 days earlier, had been filled with excitement about her impending arrival. He had described the final improvements to the cabin, the excellent condition of his small herd, and his plans for showing her the best fishing spots along Plum Creek. Nothing suggested any problems or concerns that might prevent him from meeting her train. As evening fell over Kearney, Catherine stood at her window watching the town settle into night. Oil lamps flickered in windows, and the sounds of the day gave way to music and conversation from the saloon down the street. But the prairie beyond the town remained dark and silent, offering no clues about Samuel Morrison's whereabouts. She tried to eat the dinner Mrs. Crawford brought to her room, but worry had destroyed her appetite. Every scenario she imagined seemed worse than the last. Samuel could be injured, dealing with some crisis on his homestead, or facing problems he hadn't mentioned in his letters. Worse possibilities lurked at the edges of her mind. What if he had changed his mind about marrying her? What if the considerate man of the letters was a fiction, and she had traveled across a continent to meet a stranger who no longer wanted her? Sleep came fitfully, broken by unfamiliar sounds and the anxiety that clawed at her chest. Catherine had never felt so alone or vulnerable. In Philadelphia, she had at least known the rules and dangers of city life. Here, in this prairie wilderness, she was completely dependent on the kindness of strangers and the promises of a man who might already have abandoned her. The next morning brought news that would change everything Catherine thought she knew about her future and set her on a path she could never have imagined. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next morning brought Janet Parker back to town with news that made Catherine's blood run cold. Janet's face was pale with shock as she dismounted from her lathered horse outside the hotel, her usual composed demeanor shattered by whatever she had discovered at Samuel Morrison's homestead. "Catherine," Janet called as she spotted her waiting anxiously on the hotel's front porch. "You need to come with me, right now." The urgency in Janet's voice sent ice through Catherine's veins. "What's happened? Where's Samuel?" Janet's eyes were haunted as she helped Catherine gather her belongings. "The homestead, it's been burned, completely destroyed. Tom's still out there searching, but—" She paused, clearly struggling with the words. "Catherine, we found evidence of a fight. Blood on the ground. Samuel's horse is gone, but his wagon's still there, overturned and burned." Catherine felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The careful future she had planned, the security she had traveled so far to claim, had been reduced to ash and uncertainty. Is Samuel? "We don't know," Janet said honestly. "Could be he got away, could be he was taken, could be worse. Tom found tracks leading north toward the Platte River, but they're days old. Whatever happened here occurred at least 3 days ago, maybe more." As they rode out from Kearney in Janet's wagon, Catherine tried to process this nightmare. She had left Philadelphia with nothing but hope and determination. Now she faced the possibility that Samuel Morrison was dead, his homestead destroyed, and her future once again uncertain. The Nebraska prairie, which had seemed so full of possibility from the train window, now felt hostile and threatening as they traveled the rutted trail toward what remained of Samuel's dream. The destruction was even worse than Janet's grim description had prepared her for, where Samuel's letters had described a growing homestead with a solid cabin, barn, and outbuildings. Catherine found only charred ruins and scattered debris. The main cabin had been reduced to a foundation of blackened stones and a collapsed chimney that pointed accusingly at the empty sky. The barn was a skeleton of burned timber, and even the chicken coop had been torched. But it was the personal details that broke Catherine's heart. Scattered around the ruins were fragments of the life Samuel had been building, a partially burned rocking chair he had mentioned making for her, pages from books he had treasured, twisted metal that had once been kitchen implements. Everything spoke of violence and deliberate destruction rather than accidental fire. Tom Parker emerged from searching the burned barn, his face grim with anger and frustration. "Whoever did this was thorough," he reported to his wife and Catherine. "Took the livestock, destroyed everything they couldn't carry, and made sure nothing useful was left behind." "Indians?" Janet asked. though her tone suggested she doubted it. Tom shook his head. This wasn't Indian work. Too systematic, too vindictive. Indians would have taken what they needed and moved on. This looks like the work of men who wanted to send a message. Catherine walked slowly through the ruins, trying to understand how such destruction could have occurred. Samuel's letters had mentioned no conflicts with neighbors, no threats or disputes that might have led to violence. He had written about the challenges of frontier life, harsh weather, crop failures, isolation, but never about human enemies who might destroy everything he had worked to build. "There's been trouble in the territory lately," Tom explained as he joined Catherine among the ruins. Groups of men targeting isolated homesteads, stealing livestock and supplies, sometimes worse. The territorial authorities are spread too thin to provide much protection, and settlers like Sam are pretty much on their own. The realization hit Catherine like a physical blow. Samuel Morrison hadn't simply disappeared or changed his mind about their marriage. He had been the victim of organized criminals who preyed on isolated settlers. Whether he was dead or had been taken captive, his carefully planned life had been destroyed by men who viewed other people's dreams as opportunities for theft and violence. "What am I supposed to do now?" Catherine asked, the question escaping before she could stop herself. She had no money for return passage to Philadelphia, no family to wire for help, and no resources to sustain herself in a frontier town where she knew no one. Janet's expression was sympathetic but realistic. "That's a hard question, honey. Tom and I would take you in temporarily, but we've got 5 children of our own and barely enough to get through winter. The hotel's expensive, and work for women is scarce around here." Catherine felt the familiar weight of desperation settling on her shoulders. Once again, she was a woman alone, with limited options and dwindling resources. The pattern that had driven her from Philadelphia seemed to be repeating itself on the Nebraska frontier. But as she stood among the ruins of Samuel's dreams, something inside Catherine began to harden rather than break. She had not traveled 200 miles and risked everything she had just to give up at the first sign of adversity. Samuel Morrison might be gone, but his vision of building something lasting on the prairie resonated with her more strongly than ever. "I want to search the area more thoroughly," Catherine announced, surprising both Tom and Janet. If Samuel escaped, he might have left signs. If he was taken, there might be clues about where or by whom. And if he's... She couldn't finish the sentence, but her meaning was clear. Tom looked skeptical. "Catherine, we've been over this ground pretty carefully. The trail's cold, and tracking isn't really—" "I'm not talking about tracking," Catherine interrupted. "I'm talking about looking at this place the way someone who lived here would look at it. Samuel wrote to me about every building, every improvement, every corner of this homestead. If he had time to hide anything or leave any kind of message, I might recognize what you've missed." It was a desperate hope, but it was better than passive acceptance of disaster. Catherine began a systematic examination of the ruins, looking for anything that seemed out of place or inconsistent with Samuel's descriptions of his property. Most of what she found only deepened her understanding of the violence that had occurred here: bullet holes in the remaining timber, signs of a desperate fight, evidence that the destruction had been both thorough and deliberate. But as the afternoon sun began to slant low across the prairie, Catherine noticed something that made her heart race with sudden hope. Near the ruins of what had been Samuel's workshop, partially concealed by fallen timber and debris, was a wooden root cellar that appeared to have escaped the fire. The heavy wooden door was slightly ajar, and fresh scratches in the dirt around. The entrance suggested recent use. "Tom!" Catherine called, her voice tight with excitement. "Come look at this!" Tom and Janet hurried over as Catherine carefully pulled open the cellar door. The space below was dark and musty, but dry, and apparently untouched by the fire above. Catherine could make out shelves lined with preserved foods, tools, and supplies that Samuel had stored for winter. But it was the sounds that made Catherine's breath catch in her throat, soft whimpering and the shuffle of movement in the darkness. Below, something was alive down there, hiding in the shadows. "Hello?" Catherine called gently, her heart pounding. "Is someone there? It's safe now. We're here to help." The response came as a whisper so faint she almost missed it. "Please don't hurt us. We haven't done anything wrong." Catherine felt tears spring to her eyes as she realized what they had found. "Children?" she breathed to Tom and Janet. "There are children down there." Tom immediately climbed down into the cellar, his voice gentle but urgent. "It's all right, kids. We're friends. Nobody's going to hurt you. Come on up where we can see you." What emerged from that dark cellar would be burned into Catherine's memory forever. 8 children, ranging in age from what appeared to be about 3 to 14, climbed slowly up the wooden steps into the dying daylight. Their clothes were torn and filthy, their faces gaunt with hunger and marked by exposure to smoke and fear. They moved with the careful wariness of wild animals, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. The oldest boy, perhaps 14, kept the others behind him as he faced the adults with hollow but defiant eyes. "We didn't steal anything," he said, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "We were just trying to stay alive." Catherine knelt to bring herself to the children's eye level, her heart breaking at the sight of their obvious suffering. "What are your names? How long have you been hiding down there?" The boy looked at her suspiciously, clearly debating whether these new adults could be trusted. "I'm Marcus," he said finally. "These are my brothers and sisters. We've been down there since the bad men came." "How long ago was that?" Janet asked gently, Marcus's face scrunched with the effort of remembering. 3 sleeps, maybe 4. They came at night, shooting and yelling. Ma and Pa told us to hide in the cellar and not come out no matter what we heard." Catherine felt her stomach drop as the full implications became clear. These weren't Samuel's children. They were the offspring of other settlers, probably neighbors, whose homestead had been attacked by the same men who had destroyed Samuel's place. They had been hiding in Samuel's root cellar, surviving on preserved foods and rainwater, waiting for parents who would never return. "Where are your parents now?" Tom asked, though his expression suggested he feared the answer. The youngest child, a little girl with matted blonde hair, began to cry. "They wouldn't wake up," she sobbed. "We tried and tried, but they wouldn't wake up." Marcus put a protective arm around his sister, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "The bad men hurt them," he said simply. "We buried them as best we could. Before we ran here to hide." Catherine felt a rage building in her chest, unlike anything she had ever experienced. These children had watched their parents murdered, had buried them with their own small hands, and had been surviving in a root cellar for days, with no idea whether help would ever come. The casual cruelty of it was overwhelming. But alongside the rage came something else, a fierce protectiveness that surprised Catherine with its intensity. These 8 orphaned souls needed help that she was uniquely positioned to provide. She had come to Nebraska territory to build a family with Samuel Morrison. That dream was gone, but perhaps she could build a different kind of family from the wreckage. "What are your names?" Catherine asked the other children, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. The introductions came slowly, prompted by Marcus, when the younger ones seemed too frightened to speak. There was Emma, the 3-year-old who clutched her corn-husk doll, twins Jacob and Joshua, about 5 years old, Sarah, perhaps 7, Michael, 9, Rebecca, 11, and Lucy, who looked to be about 12, 8 children who had lost everything, just as Catherine had lost the future she had planned. 8 young lives that would end in starvation or worse if no one took responsibility for them. 8 opportunities to build something meaningful from the ashes of tragedy. As the sun set over the burned homestead, casting long shadows across the prairie, Catherine made a decision that would change not only her own destiny, but the fate of 8 children who had no one else in the world. "You're coming with me," she announced, her voice carrying a certainty she didn't entirely feel. "All of you. We're going to figure this out together." Tom and Janet exchanged worried glances. "Catherine," Janet said carefully, "that's a noble impulse, but taking care of 8 children requires more resources than you have. You don't even have a place to live." Catherine looked at the ruins around them, then at the 8 pairs of eyes watching her with desperate hope. "Then we'll build one," she said simply. Samuel Morrison believed in creating something lasting. On this prairie, these children need a home, and I need a purpose. Maybe we can provide both for each other. It was an impossible dream, born from desperate circumstances. Catherine had no money, no home, no experience with children, and winter was approaching on the Nebraska frontier. But as she looked at Marcus, trying to comfort his frightened siblings, she knew she had found her real reason for coming west. She hadn't traveled to Nebraska Territory to marry Samuel Morrison. She had come to save these 8 children and discover what she was truly capable of when everything depended on her courage and determination. The mail-order bride who had stepped off the train in Kearney no longer existed. In her place stood a woman who would move heaven and earth to protect the family she had just chosen from the ruins of someone else's shattered dreams. The first night with 8 frightened children huddled in the Kearney Hotel tested every ounce of Catherine's resolve. Mrs. Crawford had reluctantly agreed to house them temporarily, but her expression made it clear this arrangement couldn't last more than a day or two. Catherine's small savings would be depleted within a week at hotel rates, and that was assuming she could even find permanent lodging for such a large group. The children pressed together on the floor of Catherine's small room, too traumatized to sleep properly. Little Emma whimpered in her dreams, while Marcus sat rigid against the wall, watching the door with exhausted vigilance. The older children, Rebecca, Lucy, and Michael, whispered among themselves, their conversations dying. Whenever Catherine approached, "They don't trust me yet," Catherine confided to Janet Parker, who had stayed in town overnight to help with the immediate crisis. "They've lost everyone they've ever depended on. Why should they believe I won't abandon them too?" Janet studied the sleeping children with obvious concern. "Trust takes time, but Catherine, you need to think practically. 8 children require food, clothing, shelter, and eventually education. Even if you could find work in town, no job would pay enough to support a family this size." The mathematics were stark and unforgiving. Catherine had $47 remaining from her travel money, barely enough to feed 8 children for a week. Her few possessions could be sold for perhaps another $20. Winter was approaching on the Nebraska prairie, bringing weather that could kill the unprepared. She needed to find sustainable income, permanent shelter, and community support for children who had no legal claim on anyone's help. But as Catherine watched Marcus gently adjust a blanket around his sleeping sister Sarah, she felt her determination crystallize into something unbreakable. These children had survived horrors that would have broken most adults. If they could find the strength to keep going, she could find the strength to provide for them. "What if we didn't try to make it work in town?" Catherine asked Janet suddenly. "What if we went back to Samuel's land and rebuilt from scratch?" Janet's eyes widened in shock. "Catherine, that's madness. The land's not even legally yours, and building a homestead requires resources you don't have. Plus, whoever destroyed Samuel's place might come back." Catherine had been thinking about this possibility since discovering the children. Samuel's homestead was located on unclaimed territory that he had been improving under the Homestead Act. With Samuel missing and presumed dead, the land would revert to government control unless someone else filed a claim and proved they could make it productive. The Homestead Act allows single women to file claims, Catherine said, her mind racing through possibilities. I could establish legal right to the land, and then we'd have a place to build. The children could help with the work. They know farming, and they understand this country better than I do. You're talking about starting a farm with no equipment. No livestock, no seed money, and no experience, Janet pointed out. Even experienced farmers fail out here. What makes you think you can succeed? Catherine looked at the 8 children sleeping on her hotel room floor. Because failure isn't an option. These children will die if I don't find a way to provide for them. That makes me stronger than experience or money ever could. The next morning brought Catherine's first lesson in the bureaucratic complexities of frontier life. At the Territorial Land Office, she faced a skeptical clerk who clearly doubted her ability to fulfill homestead requirements. Miss Walsh, the clerk said, reviewing her application, homestead law requires you to build a dwelling, cultivate a specified acreage, and live on the land for 5 continuous years. Most single women who attempt this fail within the first winter. What about the improvements Samuel Morrison already made? Catherine asked. Doesn't the root cellar and cleared land count toward the requirements? The clerk consulted his records. Morrison filed his claim but never completed the proving up process. His improvements might reduce your cultivation requirements, but you'd still need to build a proper dwelling and demonstrate productive use of the land. Catherine signed the papers with a steady hand, committing herself to 5 years on the prairie, and success that would require miracles. But as she walked back to the hotel, she began to see possibilities where others saw only obstacles. The older children possessed skills that could be invaluable in establishing a working homestead. Marcus had helped his father with livestock and could identify good grazing areas. Rebecca knew which wild plants were edible and which were dangerous. Lucy could sew and cook, while Michael understood the basics of crop rotation and soil management. We're going back to the burned place, Catherine announced to the children when she returned to the hotel. We're going to build a new home there. The reaction was immediate and mixed. Several of the younger children began crying, while Marcus looked at Catherine as if she had lost her mind. That's where the bad men came, whispered Jacob, one of the 5-year-old twins. They might come. Back! Catherine knelt in front of the frightened boy, taking his small hands in hers. Yes, they might. But Jacob, we can't spend our lives running from what might happen. We need a place to build something good, something that belongs to us. That land is where we can do it. With what? Marcus demanded, his 14-year-old. Skepticism cutting straight to the heart of their challenges. We got no money, no tools, no nothing. How are you planning to build anything? Catherine had been wrestling with the same question, but talking with the children was helping her think through solutions. We start small and build as we go. The root cellar survived the fire. That gives us shelter while we work. There are still usable stones from the foundation, and the territory has plenty of timber if we know where to look. That's not how farming works, Marcus protested. You need seed, livestock, equipment. You need money to buy supplies for winter. People die out there when they're not prepared. Catherine felt the weight of his words, but she also heard something else in Marcus's voice. Fear that masked deeper knowledge. This boy had lived through the violent destruction of everything he had known. His skepticism came not from ignorance, but from painful understanding of how quickly security could be destroyed. Marcus, Catherine said carefully, you know more about surviving on the prairie than I do. Instead of telling me why it won't work, help me figure out how it could work. For a moment, the boy's adult mask slipped, revealing the frightened child underneath, but then his expression grew thoughtful rather than dismissive. Well, Marcus said slowly, there's wild game if you know how to trap it, and the creek that runs through Samuel's land has good water year-round. Ma always said the soil there was rich. That's why Pa wanted to trade for land closer to it. Rebecca, who had been listening quietly, added her own observations. There's wild berries and nuts if you know where to look, and plenty of prairie. Grass for thatch or stuffing mattresses. Catherine felt excitement building as the children began to engage with the problem rather than simply fearing it. These young people possessed knowledge accumulated through years of frontier life. If she could harness their skills and combine them with her own determination, they might actually have a chance. The next week was spent in intensive preparation that tested Catherine's ability to organize complex logistics with limited resources. Tom Parker proved invaluable, helping Catherine purchase basic tools and supplies on credit from sympathetic merchants in Kearney. Janet contributed practical items her own family could spare: cast-iron pots, blankets, preserved foods, and warm clothing the children desperately needed. But the most crucial assistance came from an unexpected source. Dr. William Hayes, Kearney's only physician, approached Catherine after hearing about her plans from Mrs. Crawford. "Miss Walsh," Dr. Hayes said, "I understand you're planning to establish a homestead with these orphaned children." Catherine tensed, expecting another lecture about the impossibility of her plan. "Yes, Dr. Hayes, we're going to make it work." The doctor smiled, surprising her. "I believe you might. I've seen what desperation and determination can accomplish on the frontier, but I have a proposition that could improve your chances considerably." Dr. Hayes explained that he had been looking for someone to establish a way station between Kearney and the scattered homesteads to the northeast. Settlers in that region often needed medical attention but couldn't travel to town, especially during winter months. "If you could provide basic medical care and emergency shelter for travelers, I could pay you a monthly fee and provide medical supplies," Dr. Hayes offered. "It wouldn't be much money, but it might be enough to help you get established." Catherine felt hope flare in her chest. This could be the sustainable income source that would make their homestead viable. "What kind of medical care? I don't have training." "Basic wound cleaning, fever management, assisting with childbirth. Things any frontier woman learns by necessity. I could teach you the essentials, and for serious cases, you'd send for me." Catherine accepted Dr. Hayes's offer immediately, understanding that it represented far more than money. It gave their homestead a purpose beyond mere survival, a way to serve the scattered community and establish their place in it. As their departure date approached, Catherine found herself having individual conversations with each child about what they were undertaking together. The younger ones seemed to view it as an adventure, trusting Catherine's confidence even when they didn't understand the challenges ahead, but the older children understood the risks more clearly. "Are you sure about this?" Lucy asked during one of these conversations. At 12, she was old enough to remember the brutal work required to establish a frontier farm. "What if we fail? What if we can't make it work?" Catherine considered the question seriously. "Lucy, I'm not sure about anything except that we have to try. The 8 of you deserve a real home, a real family, and a real chance at life. I can't promise it will be easy, but I can promise I'll never stop fighting to give you those things." The girl studied Catherine's face with the premature wisdom that frontier life forced on children. "And what if the bad men come back?" Catherine felt her jaw set with determination. "Then they'll find out that a woman protecting her family is more dangerous than they ever imagined." On a crisp October morning, Catherine Walsh and 8 orphaned children loaded their few possessions into Tom Parker's wagon and set out for the burned homestead that would become their new home. Catherine carried the legal papers proving her claim to the land, a small pouch of silver coins that represented their entire treasury, and a determination that had been forged in the fires of other people's tragedies. As they traveled the rutted trail toward Samuel Morrison's destroyed dreams, Catherine felt the profound weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. 8 lives depended on her ability to create something from nothing, to build not just shelter and security, but a family bound together by choice rather than blood. The scattered stones and burned timber of the homestead looked even more daunting in the morning light, but Catherine refused to let doubt show on her face. These children had already survived the impossible. Now it was her turn to prove that love and determination could overcome any obstacle the prairie placed in their path. The real work was about to begin. The first snowfall came earlier than expected, just 3 weeks after Catherine and the children had begun rebuilding on Samuel's land. Catherine woke to find white crystals dusting the canvas tarp that served as their temporary roof over the enlarged root cellar, and her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Winter on the Nebraska prairie had arrived with barely enough time to prepare. In those 3 weeks, they had accomplished what seemed impossible. Working from dawn to dusk, the makeshift family had transformed the root cellar from a hiding place into livable quarters for 9 people. Marcus and Michael had proven surprisingly skilled at carpentry, using salvaged lumber to build sleeping platforms along the walls. Rebecca and Lucy had sewn canvas partitions to create privacy, while the younger children had gathered prairie grass for insulation and bedding. Catherine herself had thrown herself into the physical labor with an intensity that surprised everyone, including herself. Her hands, once soft from indoor textile work, were now calloused and strong from hauling stones, splitting wood, and digging drainage trenches around their underground home. The genteel woman who had stepped off the train in Kearney seemed like a stranger from another lifetime, but the early snow meant their preparations would face their first real test sooner than anticipated. Their food supplies, carefully rationed from what they could afford in town, plus what they had preserved from wild sources, would need to last until spring. The shelter that felt adequate in October might prove inadequate when prairie winds brought temperatures far below zero. How bad do winters get here? Catherine asked Marcus as they stood outside the cellar, watching the snow dust the endless grassland around them. Marcus's expression was grim beyond his 14 years. Bad enough to kill you if you're not ready. Last winter, the Hendersons lost their youngest to pneumonia, and the Kowalskis had to burn their furniture to keep from freezing. Catherine felt a familiar chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The responsibility for 8 young lives weighed heavier with each reminder of how unforgiving the frontier could be. But she also felt something else. A fierce protectiveness that grew stronger with every challenge they faced together. "Then we make sure we're ready," Catherine said firmly. "What do we need to do?" The next few days brought a crash course in winter survival that tested every resource they possessed. Marcus taught Catherine and the older children how to identify the signs of severe weather approaching, while Rebecca showed them which roots and bark could supplement their diet when other food ran low. Even little Emma contributed by learning to tend the small fire that provided their only heat and light. Their first crisis came when 6-year-old Joshua developed a fever that spiked dangerously high during their 4th night in the snow. Catherine found herself applying the basic medical training Dr. Hayes had given her, bathing the boy with cool water and forcing fluids down his throat while his twin brother Jacob watched with terrified eyes. "Is Joshua going to die like Ma and Pa?" Jacob whispered, as Catherine checked his brother's temperature for the 10th time that night. Catherine felt her heart break at the question, but she kept her voice steady. "No, Jacob, Joshua is going to be fine because we're going to take care of him properly." She spent 3 sleepless nights nursing Joshua through his fever, using techniques Dr. Hayes had taught her and remedies Rebecca remembered from her mother. When the boy's fever finally broke and he opened clear eyes for the first time in days, Catherine felt a triumph more profound than any success she had ever achieved. "You saved him," Marcus said quietly, watching Catherine feed broth to his recovering brother. "He would have died without you." The comment revealed something Catherine was only beginning to understand about her relationship with these children. She had taken responsibility for their survival, but they were teaching her things about strength and resilience that she had never learned in Philadelphia. Each challenge they overcame together forged bonds that went deeper than mere guardianship. But their success with Joshua's illness attracted attention that brought new complications. Dr. Hayes had spread word about Catherine's medical way station, and their first official patient arrived just 2 weeks after the snow began falling. Martha Stevens, the wife of a homesteader 15 miles north, had gone into labor during a blizzard and couldn't travel to town for proper medical care. "Please," begged her husband Frank Stevens as he stood shivering outside Catherine's underground home. "Dr. Hayes said you could help with childbirth. Martha's been in labor for 18 hours, and something's not right." Catherine felt terror grip her chest. Dr. Hayes had taught her the basics of assisting with birth, but she had never actually delivered a baby. The responsibility of 2 lives, mother and child, seemed overwhelming when she was still learning to keep 8 children healthy and fed. But Frank Stevens's desperate eyes reminded Catherine of her own desperation when she had discovered the peace. Orphaned children. Someone had to help, and she was the only option available. "Rebecca, get the medical supplies Dr. Hayes left us," Catherine instructed. "Marcus, help Mr. Stevens get his wife down into the cellar. We're going to take care of this." What followed was the longest night of Catherine's life. Martha Stevens was indeed having complications. The baby was breech, requiring careful manipulation to prevent injury to both mother and child. Catherine found herself drawing on every scrap of information Dr. Hayes had provided, combined with instincts she didn't know she possessed. The children proved invaluable during the crisis. Rebecca boiled water and prepared clean cloths, while Lucy kept the younger children calm and quiet. Marcus assisted with lifting and positioning, and even 9-year-old Michael helped by maintaining the fire that provided crucial light and warmth. When baby Elizabeth Stevens finally entered the world with a healthy cry just before dawn, Catherine felt exhausted but triumphant. She had successfully delivered her first child under frontier conditions, assisted by a family of orphans who had responded to crisis with the competence of experienced adults. "How can we ever repay you?" Martha Stevens asked as she held her. "Healthy daughter, you've given us our miracle." Frank Stevens pressed $2 silver into Catherine's hands, more money than she had seen since arriving in Nebraska. But more valuable than the payment was the word that spread throughout the scattered homesteading community. Catherine Walsh and her children could be trusted in emergencies, could provide help when the nearest doctor was days away. Over the following weeks, their underground home became an unofficial community center for the isolated families scattered across the prairie. Travelers caught in storms found shelter and warm meals. Injured men received wound care and medicinal treatment. Women facing difficult pregnancies or sick children found advice and assistance. Each visitor brought payment in various forms, sometimes money, but more often goods they desperately needed. A grateful father whose broken arm Catherine had set brought a milk cow that had wandered onto his property. A woman whose difficult pregnancy Catherine had monitored contributed preserves and dried meat. A trader whose wagon Catherine had sheltered during a blizzard left behind warm blankets and winter coats. "We're becoming important to people," Lucy observed one evening as Catherine organized their growing collection of supplies and medical equipment. "They depend on us now." Catherine nodded, understanding that this was exactly what she had hoped would happen. By making themselves useful to the scattered community, they had created security that went beyond mere survival. They were building relationships and reputation that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. But their growing success also brought dangers they hadn't anticipated. In late December, 3 rough-looking men arrived during a snowstorm, claiming to need shelter and medical attention for injured horses. Catherine felt immediately uneasy about these visitors. Their stories didn't match. Their horses showed no signs of injury, and they showed too much interest in the supplies and money visitors had left. "Something's not right about those men," Marcus whispered to Catherine as they prepared the evening meal. "They keep asking about who else knows we're here and what valuables we might have." Catherine's instincts agreed with Marcus's assessment. These men weren't travelers in genuine need. They were predators who had heard about the successful way station and come to investigate what they might steal. The realization sent ice through her veins as she considered how vulnerable they were. 9 people living in an underground shelter with no nearby neighbors and limited weapons. That night, Catherine made a decision that would have shocked the woman she had been 6 months earlier. She quietly distributed the few weapons they possessed. Among the older children, Marcus got Samuel's hunting rifle, Rebecca took a kitchen knife, and Lucy armed herself with a heavy iron poker from their fireplace. "If those men try to hurt any of us," Catherine told the children in a whisper, "we fight back with everything we have. We've built something precious here, and we're going to protect it." The confrontation came just before dawn when Catherine woke to find one of the men rifling through their medical supplies while his companions stood guard. Catherine's shout of alarm brought Marcus running with the rifle, while Rebecca and Lucy moved to protect the younger children. "Step away from our supplies," Catherine ordered, her voice carrying an authority that surprised even her. "Take what? Food you need for the trail and leave now." The leader of the group, a bearded man with cold eyes, laughed at her demand. "You're in no position to make orders, lady. We'll take what we want and do what we please." But the man's confidence wavered when he realized that Marcus was pointing a rifle at his chest with steady hands, while Catherine herself held Dr. Hayes's medical bag like a weapon. These weren't helpless victims. They were a family prepared to fight for what they had built. The standoff lasted only minutes before the intruders decided the potential gain wasn't worth the risk. They left quickly, taking only some bread and preserved meat, but Catherine knew they represented a larger threat that would only grow as word of their success spread. "We need better defenses," Catherine told the children after the men had disappeared, "into the pre-dawn darkness, and we need to be prepared for others like them." As winter deepened and their reputation continued to spread, Catherine realized their success had created new responsibilities and new dangers. They were no longer just struggling to survive. They were building something that needed to be protected and expanded. The mail-order bride, who had come to Nebraska seeking security, had become the leader of a frontier community that depended on her strength and wisdom. But with each challenge they overcame together, Catherine felt more confident in their ability to build whatever life they chose. The 8 orphaned children had become her family in the truest sense, and together they were creating something neither tragedy nor threat could destroy. Winter was far from over, but Catherine Walsh and her chosen family had already proven they could thrive in conditions that destroyed others. They were no longer refugees from tragedy. They were pioneers, building their own piece of the American dream from absolutely nothing but love, determination, and unbreakable bonds forged in crisis. Spring arrived on the Nebraska prairie with a violence that matched winter's fury. The snow that had blanketed their homestead for 4 months melted in torrents, turning every creek into a raging river and every low-lying area into a treacherous marsh. Catherine stood ankle-deep in mud outside their underground home, watching floodwater carry away the winter's accumulation of debris, while planning the massive expansion they would need to accommodate their growing responsibilities. Their success as a medical way station had exceeded even Dr. Hayes's optimistic predictions. Through the brutal winter months, they had treated everything from broken bones to difficult births, earning a reputation that stretched across 3 counties. More importantly, they had accumulated enough money and trade goods to transform their desperate shelter into a proper homestead that could serve the scattered prairie community. But success had also brought challenges Catherine could never have anticipated. Word of a lone woman managing a profitable way station with 8 children had reached the wrong ears, drawing attention from men who viewed their accomplishment as an opportunity for easy theft. The attempted robbery in December had been only the first of several incidents that made clear their prosperity was painting a target on their backs. "We need to build above ground this year," Catherine announced to the children as they surveyed the muddy landscape that would soon dry into workable soil, a proper house, barn, and medical facility that can handle the number of people depending on us. Marcus, now 15 and grown tall over the winter months, studied the flooded land with the expertise of someone born to frontier life. "That's a lot of building, Catherine. We'll need more help than just us 9. Catherine had been thinking about this exact problem for weeks. Dr. Hayes mentioned there are men in Kearney looking for work, farmers whose crops failed last year, immigrants needing to earn money before they can claim their own land. We could hire workers and provide something valuable in return." "What about the bad men?" asked Sarah, now 8 years old but still haunted by memories of the violence that had orphaned them all. "If we build big buildings, more people will know we're here." Catherine knelt beside Sarah, taking the girl's small hands in her own work-roughened ones. "Sarah, we can't live our whole lives hiding from what might happen. We've proven we can take care of ourselves, and we're going to keep proving it." The building project that began in April 1879 was unlike anything Catherine could have imagined when she first answered Samuel Morrison's advertisement. Using money earned from their medical services and trade relationships, she hired 6 workers from Kearney, experienced carpenters and farmers who needed employment more than they needed to question why a young woman was running such an ambitious operation. The construction crew was led by Anders Peterson, a Swedish immigrant whose family had died in a typhoid outbreak the previous summer. Anders possessed the skills to build structures that would withstand prairie storms, and the desperate need for work that made him grateful for any honest employment. His presence also provided additional security that Catherine had learned was essential for protecting their growing enterprise. "Miss Walsh," Anders said during their first planning meeting, "building what you describe will require lumber, hardware, and supplies that cost more money than most homesteaders see in 5 years. Are you certain about your resources?" Catherine spread the carefully maintained ledger that tracked their earnings and expenses across the rough table in their underground home. "Mr. Peterson, we've treated over 40 patients this winter. We've provided emergency shelter for dozens of travelers. People pay us because we provide services they can't get anywhere else." The numbers were impressive even to Catherine. Dr. Hayes's arrangement had provided steady income, but the additional services, emergency shelter, meals for travelers, basic supplies for those caught unprepared, had generated revenue streams she had never anticipated. More importantly, their reputation for reliability and fairness had created customer loyalty that brought repeat business and referrals. Construction began with the main house, a 2-story structure designed to accommodate their large family, while providing space for medical consultations and emergency patient care. Anders and his men worked with the efficiency of professionals, while Catherine and the older children contributed labor that kept costs manageable. But the most significant development came when Rebecca, now 12 and showing remarkable aptitude for medical work, demonstrated skills that surprised even Dr. Hayes during one of his monthly visits. Catherine, Dr. Hayes said after watching Rebecca expertly suture a deep cut on a construction worker's hand. This young woman has natural talent for medicine. With proper training, she could become a genuinely skilled practitioner. The suggestion opened possibilities Catherine had never considered. Rebecca was obviously intelligent and had absorbed every medical technique she had observed over the winter. If she could receive advanced training, she might eventually take over much of the medical work, allowing Catherine to focus on other aspects of their growing operation. "What kind of training?" Catherine asked, though she suspected the answer would be expensive and complicated. "There's a women's medical college in Philadelphia that accepts qualified candidates, regardless of their background," Dr. Hayes explained. "The education takes 3 years, but graduates are licensed to practice medicine anywhere in the country." Catherine felt excitement and terror in equal measure. Sending Rebecca to medical school would cost enormous amounts of money and separate their family for years. But it would also provide security and opportunity that could benefit all of them for decades to come. "I want to do it," Rebecca said quietly when Catherine discussed the possibility with her. "I want to learn everything about healing people, and I want to come back here and help our family." The decision to pursue Rebecca's medical education became another driving force behind Catherine's ambitions for their homestead. They would need to generate enough income not only to sustain their current operations, but to fund years of expensive education in a distant city. This financial pressure led Catherine to explore opportunities beyond medical services. The steady stream of travelers passing their way station had revealed demand for other services: mail delivery between isolated homesteads, supply procurement for families too busy or distant to travel to town, even basic banking services for people who didn't trust distant institutions with their money. "We could become the center of everything people need out here," Catherine explained to Marcus and Lucy as they planned the summer's expansion. Not just medical care, but communication, supplies, financial services, everything that makes scattered homesteads feel connected to civilization. The older children embraced these expanded responsibilities with enthusiasm that amazed Catherine. Marcus took charge of supply procurement, riding to Kearney weekly to purchase goods requested by their customers. Lucy managed their growing correspondence service, ensuring that letters and packages reached isolated families who might otherwise wait months for communication with the outside world. Even the younger children found roles in their expanding operation. Michael, now 10, proved gifted at maintaining their livestock and poultry, while Sarah and the twins helped with cooking and cleaning for the travelers who increasingly stayed overnight rather than risking dangerous travel in unfamiliar territory. But their success also intensified the threats they faced from those who preferred stealing to earning. In June, Catherine discovered that organized criminals were systematically targeting successful homesteads throughout the territory, using information gathered from travelers to identify the most profitable opportunities for robbery. The warning came from Frank Stevens, the grateful father whose wife Catherine had helped during that first difficult childbirth. Frank had overheard conversations in a Kearney saloon that made clear Catherine's Way station was being discussed as a potential target. "There's men asking detailed questions about your operation," Frank reported during an urgent evening visit. "How many people you got, what kind of defenses, how much money you might have stored. Catherine, they're planning something." Catherine felt the familiar cold determination that had carried her through every crisis since discovering the orphaned children. "How many men? When are they planning to come?" "Could be as many as 8 or 10. Frank's expression was grim. "And soon, maybe within the week. These aren't desperate drifters, Catherine. They're organized criminals who've hit other places successfully." That night, Catherine called a family meeting that would determine whether their growing prosperity survived or was destroyed by those who viewed other people's success as their own opportunity. "We have a choice," Catherine told the 8 children who had become her world. "We can run, abandon everything we've built, and start over somewhere else. Or we can stay and fight for what's ours." The response was immediate and unanimous. Marcus spoke for all of them. "We fight. This is our home and nobody's taking it from us." Catherine felt pride swell in her chest as she looked at the young people who had survived horrors that would have broken most adults. They had learned not just to endure adversity, but to face it with courage and determination. "Then we prepare for war," Catherine said simply, "because that's what this is, a war between people who build and people who destroy, and we're going to show them which side is stronger." The preparations that followed transformed their peaceful homestead into a fortress designed to protect everything they had sacrificed to create. Anders Peterson and his construction crew, who had become genuinely attached to the unusual family, volunteered to stay and help with the defense despite the obvious danger. "Miss Walsh," Anders said as they planned defensive positions around the new buildings, "my family died from disease, but yours survived because you fought for them. If fighting is what's needed now, then fighting is what we'll do." As Catherine watched the children and workers prepare to defend their home, she realized how completely her life had been transformed. The frightened mail-order bride, who had answered Samuel Morrison's advertisement 18 months earlier, could never have imagined leading armed resistance against organized criminals. But that woman no longer existed. In her place stood someone who would do anything necessary to protect the family and community she had built from the ashes of other people's tragedies. The 8 orphaned children who had trusted her with their lives were about to discover just how fierce a mother's love could be when everything she held dear was threatened. The criminals planning to destroy their world were about to learn that some treasures are protected by forces more dangerous than they ever imagined. The attack came at dawn on July 15, 1879, just as Catherine had anticipated. 10 mounted men emerged from the morning mist like phantoms, spreading out to surround the homestead with the practiced precision of wolves targeting their prey. Catherine watched them through the reinforced window of the main house, her heart pounding, but her hands steady as she checked the loading of Samuel Morrison's hunting rifle. "Positions, everyone," Catherine called softly to her family. Over the past week, they had drilled these defensive arrangements until every person knew exactly where to go and what to do when the moment arrived. "Remember, we protect each other. First, property second." Marcus took his position at the east window of the 2nd floor, where he could cover the main approach with clear fields of fire. Rebecca crouched behind overturned furniture on the ground floor, medical supplies within, reach for treating any wounded. Lucy shepherded the 4 youngest children into the reinforced root cellar that would serve as their final refuge if the house was breached. Anders Peterson and 3 of his men had positioned themselves in the barn, creating a crossfire that would make any frontal assault costly for the attackers. The other workers had reluctantly accepted Catherine's orders to evacuate to Kearney. She wouldn't risk innocent lives in what was essentially her family's fight for survival. The leader of the criminal band rode forward under a dirty white flag, his confidence evident in the casual way he surveyed their defenses. Catherine recognized the type immediately, a man who had grown wealthy through violence and intimidation, who viewed other people's success as his personal treasure chest. "You in the house?" the man called, his voice carrying the lazy arrogance of someone accustomed to easy victories. "I'm Colonel Wade Morrison, and I'm here to collect what you owe for operating on my territory." Catherine felt cold fury wash through her at the man's audacity. Not only was he planning to rob them, but he was claiming some fictional authority to justify the theft. She stepped onto the front porch, making herself visible while staying within range of defensive cover. "Mr. Morrison," Catherine called back, deliberately refusing to acknowledge his assumed military rank, "you have no authority here. This is legally claimed homestead land, and you're trespassing." The man's face darkened at her defiance. "Lady, you don't seem to understand your situation. I've got 10 armed men, and you've got a bunch of children and hired help. Hand over your cash box and medical supplies, and maybe we'll let you keep breathing." Catherine felt the weight of responsibility for 9 lives settling on her shoulders, but she also felt something else, absolute certainty that she would never surrender what they had built together. These criminals represented everything she had learned to hate about people who destroyed rather than created, who took rather than earned. "Mr. Morrison," Catherine replied, her voice carrying across the yard with crystal clarity, "you're about to discover that a woman protecting her family is more dangerous than 10 men looking for easy money." The criminal leader's face twisted, with rage at her continued defiance. "Have it your way, lady. Boys, burn them out." What followed was 20 minutes of concentrated violence that tested every preparation Catherine and her family had made. The attackers charged the house from multiple directions, expecting to overwhelm defenders they assumed would be inexperienced and panicked. Instead, they encountered disciplined fire from people fighting for everything they held dear. Marcus's first shot from the upper window dropped one attacker before the man could reach the porch. Anders Peterson and his men opened fire from the barn, forcing 3 more criminals to seek cover behind the wagon they had intended to use for hauling away stolen goods. Catherine herself accounted for 2 attackers who tried to breach the back. A door, her accuracy reflecting months of practice that had transformed her from helpless city woman into deadly frontier defender. But the most crucial moment came when Rebecca demonstrated courage that left Catherine breathless with pride and terror. When one of the attackers managed to break through a ground floor window, Rebecca didn't flee to the cellar as planned. Instead, she grabbed a heavy iron pan and struck the intruder with enough force to knock him unconscious, then calmly began applying medical treatment to a graze wound on her own arm. "The girl hit me," the dazed criminal mumbled as Rebecca efficiently bandaged her injury. "She was supposed to run." "That's what you get for underestimating frontier women," Rebecca replied matter-of-factly, her voice steady despite the violence raging around them. The turning point came when Colonel Morrison himself attempted to reach the house by charging directly through the defensive crossfire. Catherine found herself face to face with the man who had come to destroy everything she had built, and she felt no hesitation as she aimed Samuel's rifle at his chest. "This is for every family you've destroyed," Catherine said quietly, and pulled the trigger. The shot took Morrison in the shoulder, spinning him from his horse and sending him crashing into the mud of their yard. With their leader wounded and 3 of their number dead or disabled, the remaining attackers lost their appetite for what had turned into a genuine battle rather than an easy robbery. "Morrison's down," one of the criminals shouted. "This wasn't supposed to be a war." Within minutes, the surviving attackers were fleeing across the prairie, abandoning their wounded leader and dead companions in their haste to escape. Catherine found herself standing in her doorway, rifle still smoking, watching the destruction and chaos that surrounded her home. But the homestead still stood. Her family was alive and largely uninjured. The criminals had been defeated by people they had expected to victimize easily. Catherine felt grim satisfaction rather than celebration. This victory had been necessary, but it had also been a harsh reminder of how quickly violence could shatter everything they had worked to build. "Is everyone all right?" Catherine called as her family and defenders began emerging from their positions. The casualties were remarkably light, considering the intensity of the battle. Rebecca's graze wound was superficial, one of Anders's men, had taken a bullet through his leg that would heal cleanly, and Marcus had minor cuts from flying glass. Against 10 armed attackers, they had suffered no deaths and only minor injuries. Colonel Morrison himself lay wounded, but conscious in their yard, glaring at Catherine with undimmed hatred despite his defeat. "This isn't over," he snarled as Rebecca began treating his shoulder wound with professional competence. "There's others who'll come for what you've got." Catherine knelt beside the wounded criminal, her voice calm, but carrying undertones that made him shrink back involuntarily. "Let them come. Word will spread about what happened here today. Every criminal in the territory will know that the Walsh homestead is defended by people who shoot back." Dr. Hayes arrived that afternoon, drawn by reports of gunfire that had reached town through travelers who witnessed the battle's aftermath. His examination of the wounded confirmed that Rebecca's medical skills had prevented any life-threatening complications, but his real focus was on the implications of what had occurred. "Catherine," Dr. Hayes said as they surveyed the bullet holes and battle damage around the homestead, "you've accomplished something remarkable here. This attack was meant to destroy you, but instead it's proven that ordinary people can successfully defend themselves against organized criminals." The doctor's observation proved prophetic. News of the battle spread rapidly through the scattered farming communities, carried by travelers who had witnessed the aftermath and survivors who spread word about the failed attack. Within weeks, delegations from other homesteads were arriving to learn about defensive strategies and to propose mutual assistance agreements. "What you've done here changes everything," explained Robert Mitchell, a farmer whose spread lay 20 miles to the south. "For too long, we've been isolated targets for anyone with enough guns to take what they wanted. But if families can organize effective defenses, criminals will have to find easier prey elsewhere." Catherine found herself reluctantly becoming a leader in what was essentially a frontier resistance movement. The defensive preparations that had saved her family were being adapted by other homesteads, while communication networks were developing that would allow scattered families to call for help when threatened. But the most significant change was in Catherine herself. The battle had completed a transformation that had been building since she first discovered 8 starving children in Samuel Morrison's root cellar. She was no longer a woman seeking security. She was someone who created security for others through her own strength and determination. "You've changed," Marcus observed one evening as they planned repairs to the battle damage. "Even from last winter, you're different." Catherine considered his words while watching the younger children play in the yard where men had died trying to destroy their family. "I think I finally understand who I was meant to be," she said. "Not someone who depends on other people for protection, but someone who provides protection for others." The weeks following the battle brought a steady stream of visitors seeking medical care, defensive advice, and simply the reassurance that came from being around people who had successfully faced down organized violence. Their way station evolved from a business serving travelers into a community center that provided leadership and coordination for the scattered homesteading families. Rebecca's medical skills continued to develop under Dr. Hayes's guidance, while her experience during the battle had given her confidence that went far beyond her technical training. "I want to start my medical education next year," she announced to Catherine as they treated a farmer whose hand had been mangled in a threshing accident. "But I'll come back. This is where I belong." Catherine felt pride and sadness in equal measure. Rebecca's departure would leave a gap in their family that couldn't easily be filled, but it would also provide opportunities that could benefit all of them for generations to come. The frightened 12-year-old, who had emerged from Samuel's root cellar, was becoming a young woman with the skills and confidence to pursue professional education in distant cities. As summer turned toward autumn and their second winter on the homestead approached, Catherine reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. 18 months earlier, she had been a desperate woman, fleeing poverty and limitation in Philadelphia. Now, she was the acknowledged leader of a frontier community, the protector of a family forged from tragedy, and a woman who had proven that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle. The mail-order bride who had answered Samuel Morrison's advertisement no longer existed. In her place stood Catherine Walsh, frontier woman, mother to 8 chosen children, and guardian of a dream that had grown far beyond anything she could have imagined when she first stepped off that train in Kearney. The battle for their home had been won, but Catherine understood that the real victory was much larger. They had proven that ordinary people could build extraordinary lives when they refused to accept limitations imposed by others. And that lesson would echo across the Nebraska prairie for generations to come. 2 years after the battle that had made the Walsh homestead legendary throughout the Nebraska Territory, Catherine stood on the platform of the newly completed Burlington and Missouri River Railroad station, watching Rebecca board the eastbound train that would carry her to Philadelphia and the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. The 18-year-old woman embracing her goodbye bore little resemblance to the terrified 12-year-old who had once hidden in Samuel Morrison's root cellar. 3 years, Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. 3 years and I'll be back as Dr. Rebecca Walsh, ready to serve this community as a real physician. Catherine felt her heart swell with pride and break with sorrow simultaneously. Rebecca's departure marked the first time their family would be separated, since that terrible day when 8 orphan children had trusted a desperate mail-order bride with their lives. But it also represented the fulfillment of dreams that had seemed impossible during those desperate early months. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, Catherine repeated, savoring the sound. I like how that sounds. But remember, you'll always be our Rebecca first, no matter what titles you earn. The train's whistle announced its departure, and Catherine watched her chosen daughter disappear into a future that would have been unthinkable for any of them 3 years earlier. The transformation wasn't just personal, it represented possibilities that were spreading throughout the frontier as more families discovered they could build lives that transcended mere survival. The Walsh homestead itself had evolved far beyond Catherine's original vision. What had begun as desperate shelter for 9 refugees had become the unofficial capital of a thriving community that stretched across 3 counties. The original buildings had been expanded multiple times to accommodate their growing responsibilities as medical center, communication hub, supply depot, and conflict resolution center for hundreds of scattered families. Marcus, now 18 and standing beside Catherine as they watched Rebecca's train disappear, had developed into a young man whose business acumen rivaled any Philadelphia merchant. The supply contracts for the military fort will bring in enough money to fund Rebecca's entire education, he reported, consulting the detailed ledgers that tracked their increasingly complex financial operations. Catherine marveled at how completely her adoptive son had mastered the economic realities of frontier commerce. The frightened 14-year-old who had once protected his siblings with a rusty knife now negotiated with territorial officials, managed contracts worth thousands of dollars, and commanded respect from businessmen twice his age. What about the territorial legislature's proposal? Catherine asked as they walked back toward their buggy. The territorial government had approached Catherine about establishing a formal medical district with her homestead as its administrative center, complete with government funding and official recognition. Marcus's expression grew thoughtful. They're offering substantial money and legal authority, but they also want control over how we operate. The question is whether official recognition is worth losing our independence. It was exactly the kind of complex decision that would have overwhelmed the desperate woman who had answered Samuel Morrison's advertisement. Now Catherine found herself weighing political implications and long-term strategic considerations with the confidence of someone who had built something valuable enough for governments to covet. "What do you think Rebecca would advise?" Catherine asked, knowing that her absent daughter's perspective often provided clarity on difficult decisions. "She'd say we should do whatever keeps us most able to help people," Marcus replied without hesitation. "Official recognition doesn't matter if it prevents us from doing the work that makes us valuable." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a rider whose urgent demeanor immediately commanded Catherine's attention. James Henderson, a homesteader from 40 miles north, had pushed his horse hard to reach them, and his face carried the grim expression that meant serious trouble somewhere in their extended community. "Mrs. Walsh," James called as he dismounted, "we need Dr. Hayes and your medical supplies. There's been an accident at the Morrison construction site. 3 men trapped when a building collapsed." Catherine felt the familiar surge of purposeful energy that came with medical emergencies. "How bad are the injuries? How long ago did it happen?" 2 hours, maybe 3. One man's unconscious, another's got a crushed leg, and the third is pinned. Under timber, but still talking. They need help now if they're going to survive. Catherine was already calculating logistics as they hurried toward the homestead. Dr. Hayes was visiting patients 30 miles south, but their medical supplies and trained assistants could provide crucial emergency care until he arrived. Most importantly, Lucy had developed surgical skills that made her capable of handling complex trauma cases independently. "Marcus, send riders to fetch Dr. Hayes and spread word that we're responding to a major emergency," Catherine instructed. "Lucy, prepare the surgical kit and emergency supplies. We leave in 15 minutes. The response that followed demonstrated how completely their operation had evolved from desperate improvisation into professional efficiency. Within 20 minutes, a medical team consisting of Catherine, Lucy, 2 trained assistants, and a wagon full of supplies was racing north toward the emergency, while riders carried messages to Dr. Hayes and other medical practitioners throughout their network. The accident scene that awaited them was worse than James Henderson's description had suggested. A partially completed grain elevator had collapsed during construction, trapping 3 workers under tons of lumber and machinery. The survivors on site had managed to free 1 man, but the other 2 remained pinned beneath wreckage, too heavy for the available workers to move safely. "We need to get that timber off them without causing more damage," Catherine told the gathered workers as she surveyed the situation. "And we need to do it fast. That unconscious man is showing signs of internal bleeding." What followed was 6 hours of the most challenging medical work Catherine had ever undertaken. Working by lantern light as darkness fell, she and Lucy performed emergency surgery on unstable ground, while other workers carefully removed debris from around the trapped men. The unconscious victim required immediate surgery to stop internal bleeding, while the man with the crushed leg needed amputation to prevent gangrene. "Catherine," Lucy whispered during a brief break in their surgical work, "that leg amputation is beyond anything I've done before. Are we really qualified for this?" Catherine looked at her 19-year-old daughter, seeing the same combination of fear and determination that had carried all of them through countless crises. "Lucy, 3 years ago I'd never delivered a baby. Now I've delivered dozens. We become qualified by doing what has to be done when no one else can do it." The surgery that followed tested every skill Catherine and Lucy had developed over years of frontier medical practice. Working with improvised tools and inadequate lighting, they successfully amputated the crushed leg and stabilized the patient's condition. The unconscious man's surgery was even more challenging, requiring delicate work to repair internal damage while maintaining his weak vital signs. When Dr. Hayes finally arrived near midnight, he found both patients stable and receiving competent post-operative care. "Catherine," he said after examining their work, What you've accomplished here tonight would challenge surgeons in the best Philadelphia hospitals. These men are alive because you and Lucy refused to accept limitations. The successful rescue operation reinforced Catherine's growing reputation as the most capable medical practitioner in the territory outside of Dr. Hayes himself. But more importantly, it demonstrated the depth of expertise her family had developed through years of responding to emergencies that would have overwhelmed less determined people. Word of tonight will spread throughout the territory, Dr. Hayes predicted as they prepared to transport the patients to the homestead for extended recovery. You've saved lives that everyone else would have written off as hopeless. As they traveled back through the prairie darkness, Catherine reflected on how completely her understanding of her own capabilities had changed. The woman who had once feared taking responsibility for 8 orphaned children now routinely made life and death decisions for an entire region's population. But the most profound realization came when she understood that her transformation had created a model other. Women throughout the frontier were beginning to follow. Letters arrived weekly from women who had read about her experiences and were attempting similar achievements in their own communities. The desperate mail-order bride who had discovered starving children in a root cellar had inadvertently become a symbol of what was possible when circumstances demanded extraordinary response. "Mrs. Walsh," said Maria Santos, the wife of one of the rescued workers, "you've given our family everything. Our husband and father is alive because you refuse to give up. How can we ever repay such a debt?" Catherine smiled as she adjusted the blankets around the recovering patient. "Mrs. Santos, you repay it by building something good with the life we've helped save. That's how it works out here. We all help each other build lives worth saving." The philosophy that had guided Catherine since that first desperate day in Samuel Morrison's root cellar had evolved into a community ethic that was transforming the scattered homesteads of the Nebraska prairie. Individual survival had given way to collective prosperity based on mutual support and shared expertise. As autumn approached and the homestead prepared for its 4th winter under Catherine's leadership, the transformation seemed complete but ongoing. Rebecca was pursuing medical education that would benefit their community for generations. Marcus was developing business relationships that provided economic security for hundreds of families. Lucy was mastering surgical techniques that made sophisticated medical care available on the frontier. The 8 starving children Catherine had rescued from tragedy had become capable adults who were reshaping their entire region through skills and determination forged in desperate circumstances. The mail-order bride who had sought security had instead created security for countless others. Standing on the porch of the house they had built from the ruins of other people's dreams, Catherine watched the sun set over the prairie that had become home to a community built on the simple principle that everyone deserved a chance to build something better. The real victory wasn't just survival. It was the creation of opportunities that would echo through generations of frontier families who would never have to face alone the challenges that had once seemed insurmountable. 5 years had passed since Dr. Rebecca Walsh returned from Philadelphia to establish the first certified medical practice in the Nebraska Territory outside of Omaha. Standing in the modern surgical facility that had replaced the crude root cellar where 8 starving children had once hidden, Catherine watched her chosen daughter perform a complex operation that would save the life of a territorial judge who had traveled 200 miles seeking her expertise. The transformation was so complete, it seemed like something from a dream. The desperate woman who had answered Samuel Morrison's mail-order bride advertisement 8 years earlier could never have imagined the bustling community that now surrounded the Walsh Medical Center. What had begun as a desperate attempt to keep 8 orphaned children alive had evolved into the foundation of Nebraska's first incorporated town outside the major railroad corridors. The governor's office confirmed the charter, Marcus announced, as he entered Catherine's office with the morning correspondence. Now, 25 and serving as the elected mayor of Walshburg, the town that had grown around their homestead, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had helped build something unprecedented on the American frontier. Catherine studied the official documents that formally recognized their community's legal status. Walshburg now boasted 847 residents, 3 churches, 2 schools, a bank, a newspaper, and commercial enterprises that served customers throughout the Central Territories. But more importantly, it had become a model for what frontier communities could achieve when built on principles of mutual support rather than individual competition. "What about the railroad extension?" Catherine asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The Burlington and Missouri had been negotiating for months to build a spur line connecting Walshburg to their main route, recognizing the economic importance of the medical and commercial center the Walsh family had created. "Approved and funded," Marcus replied with obvious satisfaction. "Construction begins next spring. By 1887, we'll have direct rail connection to Chicago and beyond." The news should have filled Catherine with triumph, but instead she felt a complex mixture of pride and melancholy. Every success brought them further from the desperate circumstances that had forged their family bonds. The children who had once depended on her for survival now led independent lives that would have been impossible without the foundation she had helped them build. Michael, now 21, had established the territory's most successful agricultural supply business, serving farmers across 3 states with seeds, equipment, and expertise that had revolutionized prairie farming. Sarah, 19, had become the region's first certified teacher, establishing educational standards that were being adopted throughout the territorial school system. Even the youngest, Emma, now 14, showed artistic talents that had attracted attention from cultural institutions in distant cities. "Sometimes I wonder if we've built something too big," Catherine confided to Lucy as they reviewed the medical center's expansion plans. At 24, Lucy had become Catherine's full partner in managing what was now a regional medical network serving over 10,000 people across 4 counties. Lucy looked up from the surgical schedule with the direct gaze that had never changed. "Since her days as a frightened 11-year-old, Catherine, you taught us that building something meaningful requires growing beyond what you originally planned. We're not too big. We're exactly what this region needed." The observation reminded Catherine of a truth she sometimes forgot in the complexity of their current operations. Their success hadn't been planned or predicted. It had emerged organically from the simple principle of refusing to abandon people who needed help. Every expansion had been driven by genuine need rather than ambition, creating sustainable growth based on real value rather than speculation. But the most profound validation of their approach came through an unexpected visitor who arrived on the morning train from Omaha. Catherine was treating a rancher's broken arm when Lucy announced that Territorial Governor Silas Garber was requesting an immediate meeting. "Governor Garber," Catherine said as she welcomed Nebraska's chief executive into her office. "This is an unexpected honor. What brings you to Walshburg?" Governor Garber, a distinguished man in his 50s who had served Nebraska since its territorial days, studied Catherine with obvious curiosity. "Mrs. Walsh, I've come to discuss something that could affect the entire future of the American frontier." Catherine felt her attention sharpen. Visits from territorial governors typically involved either serious problems or extraordinary opportunities. "What kind of discussion, Governor?" "The federal government is developing new policies for Western settlement and development," Governor Garber explained. Congress wants to understand how communities like yours achieve success where others fail. Your homestead has become a case study in effective frontier development. Catherine felt surprised by the scope of governmental attention their community had attracted. "I'm not sure I understand what makes us special, Governor. We simply did what was necessary to help people survive and prosper." Governor Garber smiled at her response. "Mrs. Walsh, that's exactly what makes you special. Most frontier communities are built around individual exploitation of resources, mining strikes, cattle ranches, railroad speculation. Walshburg was built around service to others, and that's created sustainable prosperity instead of boom and bust cycles." The governor went on to explain that federal officials were studying their community as a model for future settlement policies. The mutual support networks, the emphasis on education and medical care, the integration of different ethnic and economic groups, all represented approaches that could be replicated throughout the expanding territories. Congress is considering legislation that would provide federal support for communities that adopt your organizational principles, Governor Garber continued. But they want assurance that these methods can work in different geographical and cultural contexts. Catherine felt the weight of unexpected responsibility settling on her shoulders. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Serve as an advisor to the Federal Settlement Board. Help design policies that could transform how America develops its frontier regions. Your experience could influence how millions of future Americans build their communities." The offer was simultaneously flattering and overwhelming. Catherine had never sought influence beyond her immediate community, but she also understood that their local success carried broader implications. If their approaches could help other families avoid the desperate circumstances that had forged her own story, perhaps she had an obligation to share what they had learned. "I'll need to discuss this with my family," Catherine replied. "Our success has been collective. Any decisions about sharing it should be collective as well." That evening, Catherine called a family meeting that brought together all 8 of her chosen children, now adults, with their own perspectives on the extraordinary journey they had shared. The discussion that followed revealed how completely their individual transformations had been shaped by the collective experience of building something meaningful together. "You should do it," Rebecca said immediately. "Everything we've learned about healing people, about building communities, about refusing to accept limitations. Other families deserve access to those lessons." Marcus nodded his agreement. "Our business success has always been based on helping others succeed. This is just a larger version of the same principle." Even the quieter family members spoke in favor of accepting the federal appointment. Emma, now poised on the verge of her own adult independence, expressed the sentiment that carried the day. "Catherine, you saved us by refusing to accept that 8 starving children were hopeless. Maybe you can help save other families by refusing to accept that frontier hardship is inevitable." The decision to accept the federal appointment marked another turning point in Catherine's extraordinary journey. Over the following months, she found herself traveling to Washington, D.C., consulting with congressional committees and helping draft legislation that would shape American settlement policy for generations. But the most satisfying aspect of her new role was discovering how many other women throughout the territories had followed similar paths. The desperate mail-order bride who had rescued 8 starving children was not unique. She was part of a broader movement of women who had refused to accept limitations imposed by circumstances or society. "Mrs. Walsh," said Congressman William Jennings Bryan during one of their policy discussions, "what you and women like you have accomplished represents a fundamental shift in how America develops its frontier regions. You've proven that communities built on cooperation and service are more sustainable than those built on competition and exploitation." Catherine appreciated the recognition, But her real satisfaction came from the practical results of their policy. Work. Federal legislation based on their Walshburg model provided funding and support for medical centers, schools, and communication networks in developing territories. Communities that adopted their mutual aid principles received preferential treatment for railroad connections, postal services, and territorial protection. Most importantly, the federal government began actively recruiting women to serve as community organizers in new settlements, recognizing that their approaches to cooperation and collective problem-solving produced more stable and prosperous communities than traditional male-dominated development models. As Catherine's 60th birthday approached in 1895, she reflected on the extraordinary distance she had traveled from that desperate day when she first discovered 8 starving children in Samuel Morrison's root cellar. The mail-order bride who had sought security had instead created security for thousands of families throughout the American West. The 8 children she had rescued had become leaders whose influence extended far beyond their original community. Rebecca's medical innovations had improved healthcare throughout the territories. Marcus's business methods had revolutionized frontier commerce. Lucy's surgical techniques were taught in medical schools, from Philadelphia to San Francisco. But perhaps the most profound measure of their success was something that could never be quantified. The countless families who had been inspired by their example to believe that extraordinary accomplishments were possible even in the most desperate circumstances. Standing in the garden behind the house where 8 frightened children had once huddled in terror, Catherine watched her great-grandchildren play among the flowers that bloomed where tragedy had once seemed to rule. The desperate woman who had answered a mail-order bride advertisement had become the matriarch of a legacy that would echo through generations of Americans who refused to accept limitations on their dreams. She had not simply survived the frontier. She had helped create a new kind of frontier where families could build lives based on hope rather than fear, cooperation rather than competition, and love rather than mere endurance. The mail-order bride's journey was complete, but the world she had built would continue growing long after her story had become legend. Years later, historians would debate whether Catherine Walsh had been an exceptional woman who rose to meet extraordinary circumstances, or an ordinary woman who discovered that extraordinary capability lay dormant within everyone until crisis demanded its emergence. Catherine herself believed the latter, insisting that desperation rather than destiny had forged her transformation from helpless mail-order bride to frontier leader. But the evidence suggested something more profound had occurred. The 8 children she had rescued hadn't simply survived. They had thrived in ways that revolutionized their entire region. Rebecca's medical innovations were being taught in universities across America. Marcus's business methods had created sustainable prosperity for thousands of frontier families. Lucy's surgical techniques had saved lives throughout the Western territories. The ripple effects of that desperate decision to protect 8 starving children had reshaped American frontier development in ways that would influence the nation. For generations, communities across the expanding territories were adopting the Walshburg model, creating networks of mutual support that made frontier life less brutal and more sustainable. As Catherine entered her 70s, still actively involved in community leadership despite her advanced age, she received a letter that brought her journey full circle. The correspondence came from a young woman in Oregon Territory who had read about Catherine's story in a national magazine and was facing circumstances remarkably similar to those Catherine had encountered decades earlier. "Mrs. Walsh," the letter read, "I came west as a mail-order bride, but found my intended husband dead and his homestead destroyed by raiders. I discovered 6 orphan children hiding in the ruins, and I don't know how to provide for them. Your Story gives me hope that impossible circumstances can be overcome. Please tell me how you found the strength to save 8 children when you could barely save yourself." Catherine smiled as she read the familiar desperation between the lines. This young woman faced the same choice Catherine had confronted 30 years earlier: abandon children who had no one else, or accept responsibility that seemed far beyond her capabilities. Catherine's response would either encourage another woman to attempt the impossible or acknowledge that what had happened in Nebraska was too unlikely to be replicated. Her reply was immediate and decisive. "My dear child, you find the strength by refusing to search for it. You simply do what needs to be done, one day at a time, until you discover you've become someone you never imagined you could be. Those 6 children are not your burden. They are your opportunity to build something meaningful from tragedy. Trust them, trust yourself, and begin." Catherine sealed the letter, knowing she was encouraging another woman to embark on a journey that would test every limit of human endurance and determination. But she also knew that somewhere in Oregon Territory, 6 orphaned children might find the same kind of fierce protector who had once transformed 8 desperate lives in Nebraska. The cycle of rescue and transformation would continue, carried forward by women who refused to accept that circumstances were stronger than determination. Catherine's story was ending, but the model she had created would inspire countless others to discover their own extraordinary capabilities when faced with impossible choices. Standing in the parlor of the house that had grown from the ashes of Samuel Morrison's destroyed dreams, Catherine looked at the photographs covering every wall, images of the 8 children at every stage of their remarkable lives, pictures of the hundreds of families who had found help at their medical center, portraits of the community leaders who had emerged from their frontier experiment. But the image that brought her the deepest satisfaction was a recent photograph of her great-grandchildren playing in the garden where terror and desperation had once reigned. These young people would grow up believing that extraordinary accomplishments were normal, that communities naturally supported their members, and that individuals could reshape entire regions through determination and mutual aid. They would never know the desperate woman who had once stood among burned ruins, facing 8 starving children with nothing but love and stubborn refusal to surrender. To them, Catherine Walsh would simply be the grandmother who had always been strong, always been capable, always been the person others turned to for help and guidance. Perhaps that was the real measure of her transformation. She had become so completely the person circumstances had demanded that no one could imagine her as anything else. The frightened mail-order bride existed only in her own memories, a woman so different from her current self that she might have been someone Catherine had once known, rather than someone she had once been. As the sun set over the prosperous community that had grown around the homestead, where 8 children had once hidden in terror, Catherine felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had discovered that the most impossible dreams sometimes came true through nothing more than refusing to abandon them. The mail-order bride who had answered Samuel Morrison's advertisement seeking security had instead created security for thousands of others. The woman who had sought a family had built a community. The person who had hoped for survival had achieved transformation that would echo through American history. Her story was complete, but its influence would continue rippling outward through generations of frontier families who would build their own impossible dreams on the foundation of courage Catherine Walsh had proven was possible, when everything depended on refusing to give up. In the end, she had not simply survived the American frontier, she had helped create a new kind of frontier where love could triumph over violence, cooperation over competition, and hope over despair. The 8 starving children she had rescued from a root cellar had become the foundation of a legacy that would inspire Americans for generations to come. Up next, You've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.